My name is Stephen Richmond. I am chair-elect of the Section of International Law, and we are particularly delighted with this program today, which will feature Jonathan Granoff, who is chair of our Task Force on Nuclear Nonproliferation and president of the Global Security Institute, who has been doing these types of programs in a series that have included Bob McNamara, Ted Sorensen, Bob Geldof, William Perry, and others in an attempt, and Michael Douglas, among others, in an attempt to bring to you interesting and lively dialogue with persons who have really been at the forefront of key events of the day. In that regard, we are delighted to have with us Valerie Plame, who is a former covert CIA ops officer, an activist, and perhaps most importantly, as she indicated, a mom. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan Granoff, and we look forward to a very exciting dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much. You know, we've had a series of people who have done so much to enrich the quality of our lives. One could argue that Robert McNamara may have saved the world and with Ted Sorensen during the crisis with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the wisdom that they brought to the table. And the last, and Michael Douglas has done so much as the United Nations messenger of peace for disarmament, as well as what he did in what he's done for us in the realm of art. And last year we had Dr. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. And today we have Valerie Plame, who I believe not only has demonstrated character and courage, but has stood up in the face of tremendous obstacles to exemplify the values that we as lawyers hold so dear: holding government to accountability and speaking truth to power when it's necessary. So I want to go into this and begin and ask Valerie a little bit about herself. Like, where do you come from, and how did you end up becoming a CIA officer rather than a movie star?
First of all, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I don't often, in fact, maybe never, have I spoken to a group of lawyers. So I'm giving you a little break from Brexit talks and taxes. You know, I saw the titles of what you've been going through the last couple days, so this is something completely different. Let's see. I think I am not exactly what you think of when you think of CIA ops officers. But it came to me because I come from a family of public service. My father fought in World War II in the South Pacific. He became an Air Force officer. My brother was a Marine. He was wounded in Vietnam. My mother was a public school teacher. So when I was given this opportunity to join the CIA, I really jumped at it. It was, sounds corny perhaps, but it was an opportunity to serve my country. It was very clear who was wearing the black hats and who was wearing the white hats at that time. And it sounded like it was a lot more interesting than what my friends were doing.
Where were you? Who were your friends? Where were you when you had this opportunity and seized it? I mean, you know, what was the environment that you were living in? I know you grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Well, I moved around a lot because my dad was Air Force, but I went to high school outside of Philadelphia. For my undergraduate degree, I went to Penn State. So it was a quintessential college experience. My primary concern was, what am I doing on Friday night? Football games. But I always knew, and I didn't even know what NGOs were at that time, but I always knew I wanted to do something outside of central Pennsylvania. No offense whatsoever to State College. I just knew, I was like, there's a big wide world out there and I gotta find it. So I was recruited out of college, and when you're that young, what do you know? Nothing. But you figure, okay, what the hell, I'll give it a try. And I turned out to be good at it.
And what did you, what were the first strong lessons you learned when you joined the agency?
I would say a lot of my my colleagues, my co-classmates. They bring you in as a class. They were, for the most part, much older and much more experienced than I was. I was really young and had, really wet behind the ears. So I figured out that the best thing for me to do was keep my mouth shut and just pay attention. And I thought back, during my college years, I worked on a dude ranch in Wyoming. And I'm here to tell you, I knew nothing about horses when I started. Nothing. But the wrangler turned out to like me because I was willing to say, so what do I do now? And it was a great life lesson. You'll hear those stories of people bluffing and BSing their way through whatever, and that is sometimes appropriate and works. On the other hand, if you are also quite humble and honest and say, I'm not sure what I'm doing here, that can also be helpful. So in my early years, I really was just asking. And of course, nothing is more flattering to someone who has a little bit of experience than someone saying, oh, and what did you do then? But that it builds understanding and experience and lessons, but really nothing can take the place of actual experience in the field.
So within a, say, 3-year period, you went from being a sorority sister at a big state school, going to football games, and then you're at the farm. Mm-hmm. What's the farm?
The farm, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it's a training facility that the CIA has used for decades. I did first paramilitary training there, where you get to do things like fire automatic weapons, jump out of airplanes. I did interrogation exercises. I did escape and evasion in the woods for weeks at a time. The whole notion behind that is not that they are going to drop you behind enemy lines. It really is building esprit de corps. And as I say, you're going in with a certain class. These are people presumably with whom you're going to rise up through the ranks. And character really comes out when you're up to your waist in swamp water and with an 80-pound backpack. And so you really know who you can rely upon, who you can't, who will be there when they say they'll be there. And those attributes come through in sticky situations through their career, sure enough.
You jumped out of airplanes, and you're
Yeah.
qualified as a parachutist, right?
Well, I qualified. I mean, I was young. You're like, what could possibly go wrong? So after you do the paramilitary, for people like myself, I was selected to go into operations, which, by the way, I was in that really in the vanguard of women that were designated to go specifically into operations. Prior to that, it had been very much, I think, Mad Men-esque, in that the secretaries, women were relegated to support roles, secretaries or, that sort of thing. And the ones who made it into operations did so out of perseverance and grit, because they saw the guys in the office have all the fun. But they did not hire women specifically to go into operations until pretty late in the game. So the second part of my training at the farm was specifically in operations, and that's where you learn tradecraft. That's where you learn things about how to conduct surveillance, how to write intelligence report, the recruitment cycle, spot, assess, develop, recruit, and all the things that they try to teach you before you're let loose in the field, which, of course, doesn't really approximate real life.
Spot, assess, develop, and recruit involves a great amount of social skills, the ability to connect with people. And I want to recommend a book to everybody. It's called Fair Game. It's not as thick a read as it looks, because much of it has been redacted. But those of us who've done extensive litigation will be able to interlineate intellectually. And we'll get into the First Amendment issues, which are rich in terms of the publication of the book. But there's a chapter in it that I think is somewhat bold that you put in here, because it's very, it shows your most human and universal side. While you were going through the ranks in the Central Intelligence Agency, you fell in love and got married to a wonderful man. We'll talk about Ambassador Wilson in a little bit. And you had two beautiful twins. And tell us a little bit about that experience, because I think I might even read the last paragraph of that chapter after you tell us a little bit.
So I decided to include a chapter. I suffered from very serious postpartum depression after the birth of my twins. And I am blessed with, for the most part, really stable, upbeat, emotional, mental health. And I was highly educated. These children were wanted. I mean, I didn't have them until pretty late in life. I had married someone who was the love of my life, and I had no idea what was going on. It brought me to my knees. You know, recruiting Russians, piece of cake. Dealing with a couple of tiny, tiny babies, that was hard. That was hard. And because there is such a taboo around any sort of mental illness, I thought it was really important to include that in this memoir. And my publishers, are you sure, Val? You sure? Yeah, yes, I am sure. And once you begin, Prince Harry just came out publicly last week, I think, talking about the grief and what he suffered after he was so young when his mother died. And as he says, once you start take that step, it really takes a lot of courage to speak about your own experiences. You realize you are not alone. There are so many people who suffer, or they know someone close to them. And so I thought it's really important, besides the stuff I do on nuclear weapons, another thing I like to do is advocate and educate around the issue of perinatal mental health.
So you talk about postpartum depression, right?
Postpartum depression.
Yeah. Although I would not wish postpartum depression on my worst enemy, I had grown in ways I had not anticipated a year earlier, and I liked developing this side of my character. Quite different from working to keep weapons of mass destruction out of the hands of terrorists or rogue states. This harrowing experience, during which all the touchstones of my life before motherhood were lost, ultimately provided me with a more developed sense of compassion and a drive to help others in ways that I never had before. I was a changed woman. And I think that it's really, really important that in our public discourse, that the most important values that make us human, that we have enough courage to put them forward. And that it's so anomalous when we start talking about what you did as a profession, which involved nerves of steel and diligence and determination and grit, dealing with some of the most evil threats that human beings can ever create, and then at the same time have the courage and to honor the supreme value of compassion.
Yeah, huge life lesson, right? Lesson in humility. I was very independent. You could drop me into any country in the world and I would figure it out. And there is a certain sense of inevitability, and you feel pretty tough. You feel pretty tough in what I had done, and so that was quite a lesson in compassion, in humility. That again, where I wouldn't wish on anyone. It comes in different forms. Ultimately, you don't get through this life otherwise, but to draw lessons from it, and so I'm grateful.
I really believe that those character traits are the most important aspects of leadership for our country, and they're opposites of arrogance and a callous disregard for one's own suffering. Before you can feel the suffering of others, you have to feel your own sense of suffering. It's a paradox. And then, of course, the great irony is that when you have compassion for others and you act on it, it has this amazingly liberating aspect. And I think that the foundation of justice, which is what we're really in the business of, that's the fabric of what law without justice is tyranny, and justice without compassion is impossible. And so it's an attribute that's really important for the leaders of the most powerful country in the world. And we are the most powerful country in the world. We still are, and we will be to the extent that we put these values out. So you ultimately are in a situation where you are recruiting assets to help our country. How did you get there, and what were the tools that you needed to develop assets assets? What a way to call people! Come on.
It's better than agents. So, of course, the raison d'etre of the CIA is to recruit foreign nationals to provide, hopefully, critical intelligence for senior U.S. policymakers so that they can make decisions with those, hopefully wise decisions. And as I went through my career, I began to develop my expertise in counterproliferation, particularly in the nuclear sphere. Because I felt at a certain point, I was quite disillusioned with the agency, and it seemed to be quite adrift. What now? And I thought, if I stay, and you don't join government service to make a lot of money. You just don't. But if I stay, I want to do something that I feel is worthwhile. Really, that I feel every once in a while that I've done something to move the needle a little bit. And I did find that in this sphere of counter-nuclear proliferation. Jonathan and I were speaking earlier. I was explaining to him that prior to the mid-90s, there was, a couple people here, a couple people there throughout the government that thought about these things. But it wasn't until, you may recall, I believe it was 1996, there was a sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway, and dozens of people were killed. And it really made the government sit up and take notice of this emergent WMD threat. So they stood up in the CIA, in the Directorate of Operations where I was working, the Counterproliferation Division, focusing on nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And that, because a couple trends were happening at that time. One was terrorism was really beginning to pick up speed and traction. Technology through the internet was spreading much more rapidly. So they really needed to address this in a much more structured fashion than had been done previously. And I was fortunate enough to begin work there. And that's, like I said, every once in a while you feel like, I did something worthwhile.
So you are there at the beginning of the CIA's focusing on stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Let's be really clear exactly what that is. And that's biological weapons, for which there is a treaty universally banning biological weapons. Chemical weapons, which, as we know, there is a treaty banning chemical weapons universally, which our former Secretary of State, Kerry, said is now an international norm, which was violated when the Assad regime used chemical weapons. They were not a party to the treaty, but they got roped into the treaty because of the universal condemnation of the weapons. So the United States and Russia was able to say, this is a norm and you have to join this. And now, of course, we just saw that allegedly, I think most likely, Syria violated it and the United States retaliated in a symbolic way. And nuclear weapons, for which there is not a universal treaty banning the weapons, although presently which began a few weeks ago at the United Nations, 132 countries came together to commence negotiations on a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And it's odd that it got so little coverage in the American media. But from the point of view of the CIA, all three weapons were weapons that we didn't want anybody else to have. Oddly enough, we're able to take the position that nuclear weapons are good in the hands of some people, but bad in the hands of others. And former Secretary General of the UN said that these are arms for which there are no good arms, or something to that effect.
Yeah, try explaining to your Iranian friends why it's okay for Western Judeo-Christian countries to have a nuclear weapon, and it's really not okay for Muslim countries to have a nuclear capability.
I've always thought of it as if you said that no country can use polio or smallpox as a weapon, but will let 9 countries use the plague as a weapon. Somehow that just doesn't seem to fit a stability formula. So you're in the beginning of this unit or this division there, and how does it develop, and then how does it operate? Can you tell us that?
I'll speak a little bit to some of the things we were working on. You may be familiar with A.Q. Khan. Do you know who he is? He is a Pakistani nuclear, actually he's not a physicist, he's a metallurgist. And very fascinating story. His family, when India and Pakistan were divided quite violently and millions of people died, his family moved from India to Pakistan. And as you might imagine, he had quite a chip on his shoulder. And when he finished some of his studies in Pakistan in the early 60s, he went to Europe, Northern Europe, and completed his studies in metallurgy and got his doctorate. And he ended up getting a nice job at a consortium in the Netherlands. And was it 72, there was another war between India and Pakistan, and it was devastating. Pakistan was completely humiliated. And at that point, he wrote the Prime Minister of Pakistan and said, I think I can help. I want to help my country. And what he began doing at that time was collecting nuclear secrets from this consortium where he was working, which was doing research, uranium separation, and so forth. And he took these plans back to Pakistan and set up what was called the Khan Research Center, and in time became the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb. And for that, he, as someone has said, he became a combination of Jesus Christ and Elvis, as seen from, and George Washington, as such a hero in Pakistan for allowing Pakistan to enter the big boys club, as it were, on the nuclear level. So, but that wasn't, and he became quite the big man. By that I mean, he was giving out all sorts of money for schools and hospitals and poor people on the street, and he really was beloved, but that wasn't enough for him. He began to peddle nuclear wares around the world. I think it's really fair to say that without A.Q. Khan, we wouldn't be worrying quite so much today about North Korea or Iran. But it was my group where I was working, we really began to focus on his network, his worldwide network, where he was selling these nuclear widgets all over. And finally, you might recall that in December of 2003, there was a ship that had sailed from Malaysia, and it was finally stopped and boarded by British and American forces just off the coast, well, between Italy and Libya. And there were at least 5, maybe 6 crates of nuclear materials destined for Libya. They were caught red-handed. And as a result of that, Libya sort of said, okay, we give up, we give up. And Khan was placed under house arrest in Pakistan. He is now out from under that. He still enjoys Elvis rock star status in Pakistan, but a lot of his network was deeply disrupted. I think there's still bits and pieces here and there. But so that was some of the work that we were doing. And then, should I speak about what I was doing in the run-up to the war with Iraq? Do you want that?
I'd like to know, how do you do that? How do you track a network like that?
Okay.
What do you do? You don't go out in the street and just go find people?
No.
You have to set up businesses, you have to put people in the field, you have to see what are the products that people are buying, you have to track votes. What do you do?
It is an incredibly complex operation to do this. It was truly worldwide, and he had different helpers doing different things. What it requires is a hell of a lot of patience, operational savvy. You're trying to figure out you're getting into their procurement networks. You're trying to figure out who's buying what, because that tells you the state of whatever, if in his case, a nation state that is seeking nuclear capability, what are they looking for, which tells you what they lack or what they already have. And it comes down to recruiting guys in a bar sometimes. In one case, a colleague of mine was in a Dubai hotel. We knew that one of AQ Khan's very close associates was there. We knew that he had a very difficult child custody case with an ex-wife. And we knew all about that. And we knew that he was hurting. And this takes time. It takes time to develop that information. It takes time to develop rapport or trust. And he was recruited at the bar and was able to get us in. There are other points of entry, but get us in very, very close to Khan. So I want to put in a bid here because I'm totally biased, given my background of human intelligence. We spend billions of dollars a year on all sorts of cool spy stuff, satellites, and that is all in the NSA, as you know, Fort Meade up the road, growing by leaps and bounds. In fact, it was not big enough, so they had to build this enormous complex in the southern desert of Utah to go through gazillion gigabytes of information. The point is that's important, but I would argue strenuously that you cannot lose the human dimension in that, because it comes down to those relationships. Just like in what you do, you might have reams of paper in front of you, but it comes down to you reading your counsel opposite you of the table, or your reading of the client, what's missing, what is she saying, he saying. So, for example, think of just about a year and a half, 18 months ago, there were Russian tanks massing on the Ukrainian border. And of course, we knew how many tanks and what their battle formation was, and we had all sorts of satellite imagery, but I will bet that President Obama would have given his eye teeth if he knew what Putin was thinking about doing with those tanks. So that is where the importance of human intelligence comes in to the multi-billion-dollar spy industry.
So you had to have agents all over the world reporting to your division in the CIA?
Yeah.
And you were one of the people in charge of that?
Yeah, one of the people in charge of that.
I remember I had a conversation with Ambassador Jack Matlock. I was privileged to be at the reunion of the participants of the first summits between Gorbachev and Reagan. I was asked to comment, but President Gorbachev was there, Bismarck was there, Robert McFarlane was there, and Jack Matlock, who had been our ambassador in the Soviet Union at the time. And at the time of the transition from the Soviet Union to the society they have now, much of the CIA didn't trust Gorbachev. They didn't trust that this was actually happening. Matlock called it right from the beginning. And he helped guide us in such a way that President Reagan and Secretary Shultz and Deputy Secretary of State Whitehead and Baker and a whole team of people could navigate out of the Cold War without violence. And that was a brilliant, brilliant thing. And it really came down to the insights of this ambassador. My opinion is our diplomatic corps and our intelligence corps, the importance of that, the importance of the quality of people, the professionalism and the wisdom is so important. So I had the privilege of asking Matlock, what did you know that all of our intelligence agencies missed? And he said, well, I got reports full of statistics and information. He said, but I went out and talked to people. He said, I went and talked to taxi drivers in Moscow. I went out in the streets and I talked to shopkeepers. I talked to people. And they were so dissatisfied with the system that I knew that it was unsustainable because the people just didn't believe in it anymore. And they did. And then after the first summits, the word got out, and he knew this, that the United States didn't want to take over the Soviet Union. And what was the point of making all of these sacrifices and not having the food and supermarkets and the kind of consumer goods that we take for granted? Why are we making all these sacrifices for the security of the state when it's not being challenged? And the effect of that human effect, he identified. And our intelligence agencies didn't. We just had all this information, but we didn't have that wisdom. And I understand that there were a number of operations that were taken down when you were in the CIA. And so I want to thank you for that, because you were the only unit doing this at that time.
Yes, early on, as I say, it was a whole new concept. Historically, the CIA is divided along, in the operational side, divided along geographical lines, Africa division, European division, so forth. The first one that they decided to bring together operations officers like myself and analysts was the Counterterrorist Center. And this was, now it's more common, but at the time it was considered to be absolutely a breakthrough that you would have an analyst and an ops officer sitting next to each other. And that worked really well. It's a holistic approach to the threat of terrorism, and they applied that same thing to counterproliferation, bringing in world-class experts on BW, experts from across the intelligence agencies, our whole apparatus, bringing them together, and it was very successful.
So tell us about how you got outed for this work. One of the essential elements of being able to do this work is its covert nature. And that covert cover, which was essential for your career in the intelligence community, was removed. How did that happen? And bring us back to where we were, what your husband did,
Yeah.
and then how did you get involved with what your husband did? What did you have to do with what your husband did?
So I'll give you a very brief refresher, because you might know my name in CIA, but it went on for years, and it was hard to sometimes follow the thread. So very briefly, in the run-up to the Iraq War, I was head of operations for Iraq, and what our job was trying to figure out who were the key scientists in his presumed WMD program, how were they procuring this material, when were scientists traveling, this sort of thing. What really was the threat? Because we had very little intelligence on this threat, because a couple reasons. One, we had closed our embassy in Baghdad after the first Gulf War. You might recall Saddam Hussein kicked out the UN weapons inspectors in 1998. So we had very thin intelligence. So our job and we won't go into why this pivot happened, but, you know, after 9/11, it was very clear the administration pivoted rather rapidly after Afghanistan and said, Iraq, that's where we're going. That's a whole other conversation. But, so the CIA said, okay, you know, we'll get you what we got. So this is where I was working at that time. What happened, again, very briefly, is that in February 2002, there were a lot of reports circulating throughout the intelligence community about 500 tons of yellow cake uranium being transferred from Niger, a very, very, very poor West African country, to Iraq. If it was true, it would be really meaningful because it would indicate that Saddam Hussein was seeking to reconstitute his nuclear program. At the time, my husband was, he had served as ambassador, he had served as our charge d'affaires at our embassy in Baghdad during the first Gulf War. He helped obtain the release of hundreds of hostages. But in 2002, he had since retired from the State Department. He was a consultant. But I was in CIA headquarters, and someone, a young woman who worked for me, came up to me really rather rattled because someone from the Office of the Vice President had called her to ask her about these reports. And to tell you the truth, at that very time, I was much more taken with the notion that someone from the Office of the Vice President was calling a pretty low-level, that's not how it works, okay? You know, if someone at the top has a question, it goes down, it gets answered, it goes back up. So I was really quite taken with that, and an analyst came by and he said, well, he heard what was going on. He said, well, why don't you ask Joe, my husband, Joe Wilson, to check it out? I said, well, and he was saying this because he knew that Joe had served in Baghdad. Joe had also served in Niger. He knew there had been recently a coup he had helped convince the military coup leaders to go back into the barracks. So he really had some credibility there. So we asked my boss, here's what's happening. And my boss said, Valerie, next week, when you go home, can you ask Joe to come into CIA headquarters next week? We'll get the right people around the table. I said, sure. And that's exactly what I did. I went home. Joe came to CIA headquarters. Everyone from different parts of the government thinking about this was there. And Joe was the only one in the room who said, I really don't need to go, and here's why. Because we already had reports from our ambassador, from a 4-star Army general, that these reports were highly unlikely that there was any accuracy to them. But in any case, he went. He went pro bono. And he came back and he was debriefed, and he said, these reports are totally bogus, and here's why. There's no way this could happen, da-da-da-da-da. So he's debriefed, it gets packaged, redisseminated back to the Office of the Vice President, who had asked for it in the first place, throughout the intelligence community, and that was that. That was that. He went back to doing his consulting work. I go back to I wasn't even in the meeting. I was just continuing to do my operational stuff. So fast forward about a year later, January 2003, President Bush gives his State of the Union address, and in it, he says the now infamous 16 words, through the British government, we have learned that Saddam Hussein has recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. So Joe and I were watching that at different places, and when we got together that night, he said, oh, that was weird, but there are other countries on the continent of Africa that mine this yellow cake uranium. Yellow cake uranium is the raw material that is used, that is further refined, and it's fissile material. It's really important to have if you're going to do that type of nuclear bomb. And of course, we went to war in March 2003. And I was feeling that we at the CIA had failed miserably. I thought we simply ran out of time. I thought that for some time there, I thought our troops were really in mortal peril. There was no doubt if Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, he would use them. But as, of course, nothing's turning up, and the insurgency begins to get traction, there's no WMD, because we had been told, as Americans, we had been told that there was an imminent nuclear threat from Saddam Hussein. Remember all the administration officials who said, we don't want to see the smoking gun in the shape of a mushroom cloud. But that's not happening. So Joe, meanwhile, is very discreetly trying to figure out how those words got in the President's State of the Union address. After much consideration, he decided to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times entitled, "What I Did Not Find in Africa." And it came out July 6, 2003. He talked about his trip at the behest of the CIA to investigate this, that there was nothing there. And he went further and gave his opinion that said, I believe that a lot of the intelligence was cherry-picked or manipulated to take us into this war. So the very next day, the White House came out and said their version of an apology, and they said, well, those 16 words really didn't rise to the level of inclusion of the State of the Union address. And quite pointedly, all of that was left out of Colin Powell's remarks before the UN in February. In any case, Joe thought he did what he set out to do, which was hold his government to account. That's all. He had subsequently been painted as this, crazy partisan. He wasn't. Neither one of us were. He was really just trying to act out of a sense of, well, that's not right, and here's what I know. In any case, a week later, a conservative columnist who's now dead, Robert Novak, printed my name in his column and my CIA affiliation, and it felt like I had been sucker punched. And I thought of all my assets with whom I had worked, and I knew that they were going to come under suspicion. I knew my covert career was over, and I was very worried about the physical safety of my children. And then it was like going down Alice's rabbit hole, where white is black and black is white, and Washington. And yeah, you spoke about being covert. That was all over. That was really paramount to doing my work, and that was no longer possible. And it became this crazy, multi-pronged media sensation that I think, looking back now, I think in many ways was a proxy for how a lot of the American people were beginning to feel about the war.
I think that the truth matters. I think that...
Oh, how quaint.
There's a saying that sort of our law is based on pacta sunt servanda. It is the basic premise of contract law that agreements must mean something, and there's a social contract between those who govern and those who are being governed. And the basis of that is that words have to mean something, and they have to be true. So I just want to underscore the situation in which your husband came out and said what the government is saying is not possible or true, that 5 tons of yellow cake uranium can't possibly have gone from Niger to Iraq and not be seen. 500?
That's a whole bunch.
500 tons.
Yeah.
500 tons.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay. So there was none. So, but I want to just that these were not ambiguous positions. So I'm just going to read some of the things. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said, "We know where they are, the weapons of mass destruction. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad, and east, west, south, and north somewhat." White House spokesperson, "Well, there's no question that we have evidence and information that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical particularly. All this will be made clear in the course of the operation. for whatever duration it takes. George Bush, President. Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraq regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. Again, the White House. We know for a fact that there are weapons there. Simply, this is Vice President Cheney, simply stated, there's no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. And this is what we were being told, and it was alleged that the hard evidence for that was this some of the hard evidence was this yellow cake uranium. Her husband debunked it, and the retaliation was to put this entire operation that was actually substantively, materially, significantly making the world safer, and they undermined it. I mean, the gravity of that is astonishing when you look at it in relief. And when you look at the consequences of not telling the truth, of the size of the disruption of the Middle East, it is immeasurable. I have studied a little bit about one of the front companies that you had, Brewster Jennings. They have front companies. That's how they work. They're covert, you know. She had a front company that allegedly uncovered in 2002 a shipment of VX chemical weapon of mass destruction to Iraq and prevented it from happening. Now, had that material gotten there, it wouldn't have been enough to beat us in a war, but it would have been enough to say, look, they have weapons of mass destruction. I mean, yeah, what you can and can't tell me.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Okay, that's what I thought. So you're outed, and then, what is it, 14 months later? There's a prosecution against Scooter Libby. How does that happen?
No, it actually took much longer. So ultimately, you may recall, the Attorney General recused himself. Comey stepped up, and we now hear Comey a lot in different job. But they appointed a special prosecutor, Patrick Fitzgerald, and he, straight arrow, he wanted to get to the bottom of what happened. There's something called the Intelligence Identities Protection Act that was first drafted in the early 80s. Unfortunately, very poorly done. It's not really very good, and the bar is very low. So what happened was he was finally only able, the special prosecutor only brought a grand jury, he brought a grand jury together, but he was only able to prosecute Scooter Libby, who is Vice President Cheney's chief of staff. And at the end of that, he was convicted on 4 out of 5 counts. For me, the most important was obstruction of justice, because as the special prosecutor said, it was like throwing sand in the umpire's eyes. He really couldn't get to the bottom of what it was. There was I've never yet managed to have, I got close. I was in Chicago not too long ago, and hopefully one day I will have dinner with Patrick Fitzgerald, and we can do a review of what happened. My sense is that he is a prosecutor who wants to go in and feels that he's got, 85% chance of conviction. And maybe with others that were involved, Karl Rove and others, maybe it fell just short of that.
And then you had a civil trial. What
Not a
happened in
trial, no. We had, my husband and I filed a civil suit because, as you know much better than I, the bar is lower. We had, 12 John Does named as possible defendants in all of this. Because just to be clear, the reporting showed that it was far more than Robert Novak who had been given this information about me and my CIA affiliation. There were at least half a dozen other reporters coming from the White House, coming from other areas, top areas, senior officials, that were trying to push this narrative that somehow I was responsible for Joe's trip. I was accused of nepotism, you know, because Niger is, it's really a garden spot. Yeah.
Great junket.
Yeah. I had a member of Congress call me a glorified secretary, you know, because I'm a girl. And so forth. I mean, we really went through years of character assassination. It was really quite something. I guess if I'm relieved about anything, it was before social media really got up and running, because it was bad enough as it was. I mean, you have no idea, A, what it's like to totally lose your privacy overnight, or what it's like to pick up your hometown paper. At that point, we were still living in Washington, D.C., and to see your spouse being called a liar, a traitor, and everything else. I mean, they're talking about these people named Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame that I have no idea who they're talking about. They have no idea what our characters were, what we had done our entire careers. It really became deeply ugly, viciously partisan. So we were pleased to see that the wheels of justice really did begin to engage, and that we felt the FBI was our friend in doing this. Yeah, I wish there had been more convictions. I wish someone had really ultimately paid prices for that in terms of, you know, real money or real jail time. It didn't happen. But, you know.
But the important thing to us is that there was a check on the abuse of power. And the FBI did.
Yes and no, because you talked about the civil suit. So we took the civil suit up all the way to the Supreme Court. They declined to hear it. Here's what I know. I am not a lawyer, but this is what I know, what stands. That if you are high enough, if you're in the executive branch, that if you decide to go after your enemies, whether it's, you know, Nixon's enemies list or taxes or so forth, that they are immune from that. And that's, they're immune from prosecution, because that was sort of what the ruling said. It was, I think you'll appreciate this because of what you do. I went to one of the hearings here at the federal courthouse. On one side of the table were all the lawyers for Rove and Libby and others that were grouped together, and they were really a slick-looking bunch, you know, very expensive suits and briefcases and good haircuts and looked all very well put together. Our lawyer was Erwin Chemerinsky, who, as you know, just started the law school at UC Irvine. Let's just say Erwin is brilliant, but sartorially challenged, okay? I mean, his papers are like kind of spread all over the shiny wood table, and he's got legal note, and I'm going, oh my. But let me tell you, when he stood up, he was brilliant of how he was able to encapsulate the legal arguments at stake. But it came to naught, unfortunately, because it went up to the Supreme Court. They declined to hear it. And so what stands is this precedent that, you know, if you're high enough, you're going to get away with stuff.
Well, if you claim national security issues.
That's a whole other thing, yeah.
The thing. So now we have a new president.
Yes, we do.
And so let's presume that he means what he says. Let's not presume that he's just conning us. So right after he was elected, he went to the CIA and he said in part the following. When I was young, I won't try and do I won't try to do his voice there.
Leave that to Alec.
Well, let Alec do that, yeah. Well, I think we were all sort of young. That's deep. When I was young, we were always winning things in this country. We'd win with trade. We'd win with wars. At a certain age, I remember hearing from one of my instructors the United States has never lost a war. And then after that, it's like, we haven't won anything. We don't win anymore. The old expression, to the victor belongs the spoils. You remember? I always used to say, keep the oil. I wasn't a fan of Iraq. I didn't want to go into Iraq, but I'll tell you, when we're in, we got out wrong. And I always said, in addition to that, keep the oil. Now, I said it for economic reasons. And then he goes on and reflects that ISIS probably wouldn't have developed if we'd kept the oil. So I wondered, like, how a CIA recruiter can now go to a country that has mineral or energy resources and convince a patriot in that country that we're their friend.
Well, that's a good point, but I cannot let this pass without saying that I and, as far as I know, all my former colleagues were deeply offended by that appearance the day after the inauguration, which was in front of the, Jonathan called it the Wall of Martyrs. We don't call it that, but it's those that have given their lives in the CIA. And it hold a campaign-style rally. It was deeply offensive to many, many, many. But yeah, you make a point, but it's not just Trump. I mean, my opinion is that the Iraq War will be seen in history as one of our absolute worst foreign policy blunders. We will be paying for it for generations to come. As a result, look, the world was with us on September 12th, 2001. That was the peak of our influence. And through our actions, we have eroded, I believe, my opinion, we have eroded deeply our political, moral, economic standing in the world. And it's statements from the head of, the leader of the free world saying, oh, we should have taken your natural resources are not helpful.
Yeah, it certainly does a dishonor to the most fundamental values that we stand for. But there are other issues that are not just corrosive to the United States, but are probably existential to the human species. And presently, there's a bill that Senator Markey has to state that the president cannot unilaterally use nuclear weapons first, because presently there is no check whatsoever on the president's using nuclear weapons first. And our weapons are on the same high alert status they were at the height of the Cold War. There's a great opinion article in the New York Times by Bruce Blair, who was a missileer, talking about the various hacks into the computer systems, as well as computer errors that, I mean, there's one of them just in 2010, 50 nuclear Minuteman missiles sitting in an underground silo in Wyoming mysteriously disappeared from their launching crew's monitors for an hour. They went offline, and nobody knew whether we'd been hacked, whether they'd been launched. There was an hour we didn't know whether they were actually launched. So he suggests that we take the missiles off of alert status, so that can't happen, and the Russians would do the same. Senator Markey's bill, which is really quite modest, just suggests that the United States cannot unilaterally start a nuclear war, that this is in contravention of the concept that wars must get a congressional review of some kind. But we still have about 15,300 nuclear warheads in the world. And recent studies show that if a mere 100 were to go off a modest exchange in South Asia, for example, it would put in excess of 5 tons of soot into the stratosphere, lowering the temperature of the planet by a degree to a degree and a half Celsius for at least a decade, essentially ending agriculture as we know it, and thus ending civilization. And so presently, this is the situation that we're in. And I wondered if, I mean, Valerie, when you were head of the CIA's operation to stop the spread of the weapons, it wasn't addressing the possessors. It wasn't addressing the possessors. It was addressing that we could have more possessors, and let's prevent that. But I wondered if you could talk about what you think the possessors should be doing today, from your experience, from your insights.
Allow me to start first with the point that you opened, and I don't think this notion is really sunk into the public's consciousness, which is there is absolutely there's nothing to stop the president from launching a nuclear weapon. There is not a check from Congress. There is not a check from the Supreme Court. You're dreaming if you think it's the Secretary of Defense. You know, I think, I don't know if it was John Oliver or Steve Colbert who said, you know, we are delusional if we think Ivanka Trump is going to be leaning over the desk in the Oval Office saying, come on, Dad, don't. Come on, Daddy. It's like somehow she's the moderating influence. Yeah. The fact is, it's really so antithetical to what we like to believe to be our democratic ideals. War. When we are asking our sons and daughters to kill and die in our name. And this is something that is, it is unimaginable. And because it is so intimidating, we tend not to grapple with it in any real sense. As I have said, I think the good news, let me start with the bad news over the last few months, has been that we're talking about nuclear weapons. Of course, you know, people are talking about it, North Korea and so forth. And that's also the good news, because we haven't really spoken about this in any sort of meaningful way. What happened was at the fall of the Soviet Union, we had the so-called peace dividend, and for by and large, we all sort of said, phew, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Thank goodness. And in fact, the world is a far more dangerous place today because of the rise of terrorism, because of the spread of technology, because there have been proliferating, and we have non-state actors, the threat of so-called dirty bombs, which you don't need 100 in the South Asia, you just need one in Manhattan or one in downtown Washington. Not because, as you probably well know, but you know, it's not a high rate of casualties, but the panic that would ensue, and what I believe, if a dirty bomb were to go off in any metropolitan area, the population would be clamoring for martial law, because you want to make sure that it, you know, doesn't happen again. So that's where we are today. However, I'm looking for bright spots anywhere, and I think that ironically, this president that has made people think about nuclear weapons more than ever before, in a long time anyway, in any thoughtful way, he might just be the one to effect change. And what I would do is appeal to, not that I'm being invited to the Oval Office anytime soon, but I would certainly appeal to the deal-making side. I mean, this is the art of the deal guy. All right, go to it. Make the deal with North Korea. What do you have to do? But it also speaks to what we as citizens need to do to be engaged, pay attention, and you know, continue to push it. Was it 1982? There was 1 million people in Central Park, 1.5 million, depending on who's counting. And 1.5 million people in Central Park protesting against the Cold War. And this is, you know, finally got into Reagan's head that, this is something that really people are paying attention to. And that and other factors did eventually drive him to sit down with Gorbachev and to begin to reduce from a high of about 60,000 nuclear weapons in the world to where we are today, about 15,000. Something like that.
This section, to our credit, originated a resolution that the entire ABA has adopted in support of ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And just this week, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia And the head of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization did an op-ed in The Diplomat calling for renewed effort to get the test ban treaty ratified. And there's no good reason not to, because we don't have any need to test. We've tested way more than we need. And it's a symbolic gesture to the world saying that we take our commitment seriously, because we committed to ending nuclear testing in 1995 to get the indefinite extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, the ambassador that did that on behalf of the United States, Ambassador Thomas Graham, is the co-chair of the Task Force on Nuclear Non-Proliferation. So I have never made this plea, but I'm making it now. I'm asking for more membership in our task force. So if you have any interest in doing this, easy to reach me, jonathangranoff@gmail.com. I think we need some big numbers, because we have the ABA's imprimatur for this very modest policy, and we should push it. I mean, if we get one win, maybe we'll get 2 wins, and we can get heard and we can break through. But I personally don't think that that's nearly enough. We have to go to the core issue, which is that nuclear weapons themselves are more of a problem than any problem they seek to solve.
Yeah, why do they exist in the first place?
Exactly, it's an existential threat, but you can't just get rid of them like that. We have to build structures. We have to strengthen the inspection regime. We have to strengthen our intelligence capacities to make sure that there's no breakouts as we move forward. But right now, there's 96% of them are in the hands of 2 countries. So if the United States and Russia decide to lower the political value of them by taking some modest steps, it could have enormous value on the rest of the world. So I'd like to now open the floor. Now, I've made my plea, I'll finish the case to make sure that you see that this is not partisan. You know, this is not partisan. This is not Republican or Democrat. So I'm going to quote the most popular Republican president. Well, first of all, Richard Nixon brought the Biological Weapons Convention into being, and it was over his watch that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty came into force. And Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. did most of the heavy lifting for the Chemical Weapons Convention, and was instrumental in the INF Treaty and the START Treaty and the SALT Treaty. And the most popular Republican president ever said the following, and I quote, Ronald Reagan: "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The only value in our 2 nations possessing nuclear weapons is to make sure they'll never be used. But then, would it not be better to do away with them entirely? We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth." This is Reagan's inaugural address. "My central arms control objective has been to reduce substantially and ultimately to eliminate nuclear weapons and rid the world of the nuclear threat. The prevention of the spread of nuclear explosives to additional countries is an indispensable part of our efforts to meet this objective, the objective being disarmament. I intend to continue my pursuit of this goal with untiring determination and a profound sense of personal commitment. I can't believe that this world can go on beyond our generation and on down to succeeding generations with this kind of weapon on both sides poised at each other without someday some fool or some maniac or some accident triggering the kind of war that is the end of the line for all of us. And I just think of what a sigh of relief would go up from everyone on this earth if someday, and this is what I have, my hope, way in the back of my head, is that if we start down the road to reduction, maybe one day in doing that, somebody will say, why not go all the way? Let's get rid of all these things. That's Ronald Reagan. So I open it up to the floor, and let me bring the mic so that we can get it picked up on the video, and I'll gladly walk around. So, I saw you right there. Identify yourself, too.
All right. My name is Sarah, and my question is, I guess what caused the shift in your mind from the CIA mentality of nuclear weapons are good for some countries, but we need to stop proliferation, or I guess maybe there never was that rift, and you were committed just to the NPT part of it. But then the next part is your opinion on the likelihood of a JCPOA type deal with North Korea, please.
couple light questions. The first one, I would say, I didn't start with the idea that nuclear weapons were good for some countries and bad for others. I was just very involved in the operational aspects of making sure we were running good operations, trying to figure out who had what were they getting. But it wasn't until I left the agency in 2007 and I stepped away a little bit, and with a little bit of time and space, we left Washington. I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we are now. That allowed me, again, just time and space to go, wait a minute, you need to, this expression is way overused right now, but you really need to drain the swamp. Abolition it's not enough to hold back the dam. It's not enough. You really have to move toward complete abolition, because it isn't, that and climate change are absolutely existential. No matter what you care about, whether it's a Second Amendment, whether it's employment, whatever it might be that captures your imagination, pre-K education, whatever it is, none of it matters if you don't get that right. So your second question was on North Korea and
The likelihood of like eventually a JCPOA
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah, well, that sounds very legal, right? So we're right now in a truly chaotic situation. Probably many of you saw the senators that were put on a bus, taken down to the White House and briefed yesterday afternoon on North Korea. And by and large, I was really surprised when they came out. They're like, well, what do you think? And by and large, all the senators were like, it was all right, it was okay. I mean, I don't think they learned anything new. They do have skiffs up on the hill. I don't know why, but anyway. On North Korea, North Korea is a cult masquerading as a state. And this is not from me. This is from former Secretary Perry, who I've come to admire deeply. I've gotten to know him. And I think as he, I don't know, how old is he now? He's old. Yeah, he's really old, but he is as sharp as can be, and he believes that like this is going to be my last hurrah. I'm going to make sure that particularly young people are aware of this threat. So what he said about North Korea is that they are seeking three things. One, that the regime continues to stay in power. Two, that they want some respect in the world. Three, they want some help for their people, C number one, because if the people get angry enough, the whole regime will be toppled. And the way we're going about it now seems to me, I'm deeply concerned. I am deeply concerned. When you have a proposed 30% cut in diplomacy, i.e. the State Department, that means, as I think General Mattis just said the other day, I'm going to have to get more troops. And okay, so here's what the problem is. As you know, Seoul is only about 30 miles from the border, the demilitarized zone. And we have I don't think it's partisan to say that we have an impulsive leader in the White House right now, and you have an impulsive leader in North Korea. And the odds for miscalculation and misunderstanding have just gone up dramatically. And what's at stake are literally millions of lives in Seoul and South Korea, and then you start getting China really worried about it. We came very, very close to a deal, as we were speaking about earlier, under President Clinton and driven by Secretary Perry with North Koreans that would have, I believe, we wouldn't be talking about this today, but it fell apart at the last minute. There are no obvious good solutions to this. I mean, you can talk about all the treaties you want, but ultimately it's going to come down to what allows North Korea to feel that they are somehow safe and that the regime will continue in power.
So Secretary Perry, to bring that update, has said that his negotiations met all three. Mm-hmm. And I'll just refresh your recollection. When he spoke to us before, he pointed out that Kim Dae-jung, the president of South Korea, came to Washington, met with Colin Powell. Colin Powell was Secretary of State, said we're going to do the deal. Then the next day, Cheney saw it in the newspapers, went to the president and said, you can't do Bill Clinton's deal. We walked, so at that point, the luncheon with the president of South Korea was canceled. He went back. The North Koreans haven't trusted us for anything ever since. So he says now that they have the nuclear weapons, which they wouldn't have gotten, they get 1 and 2. They feel they're secure and they feel they have some degree of respect, but they don't have number 3, which is some development for their people. So there is a space in there where we could get something, and what he thinks we can get is containment, stop the program, stop it from spreading, and over time, hopefully, over time, if we can contain it, some normalization. That's not a great success, but it's better than war.
Ken Reisenfeld. As a section, we have dealt with a lot of different policy issues that fall within your strong swing zone, one of which is torture. And obviously, our view that torture is inappropriate. So as a human intelligence professional, where is the line between coercion and torture? And where is the line, where are you able to use the carrot and stick to get effective intelligence versus when do you cross that line where you get information that is not reliable?
So let me be very clear that I'm speaking as a citizen and as a former intelligence officer, not in any sort of legal capacity. Can't do that. I had no idea, and it was so highly compartmentalized within the agency. I found out, like everyone else did in the media, what was going on in terms of, I hate using that euphemism, enhanced interrogation techniques. When more and more started to come out, my husband and I both spoke out against that really very, very strongly, because it is absolutely antithetical to everything we believe in, the treaties that we've signed up for in international forums. I had heard, this is now some years ago, that there were some very high-ranking people within the intelligence community that went out to speak to the producers of that TV show 24, which always tend to show, they torture a guy and tick, 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 and if you're not able to get that information, the world will blow up. And it gave the unfortunate impression that torture works. I think if you speak to the vast majority of military professionals who know anything about it, they will say, no, it doesn't work, not to mention that it has the potential of being used on our soldiers. So it's a very, I think it's a really dark chapter. I love my job. I was so proud to serve my country. I loved what I did. And when that came out, it just felt, I'm just speaking personally, it felt terrible. And how can we, I'm not going to speak to, and it creeps me out, that's the technical term, when they talk about, what aspects of interrogation are okay and what aspects. I know they have, long, I see someone in uniform, they have the whole, the books on what you can and cannot do. How sad that we need to do that, which is not to say they're not really, really bad people in the world, and that they are seeking to do us harm. But I think it has been shown over and over again that torture does not work. When someone is hurting you, you will say anything to make it stop. And another pop culture thing in Zero Dark 30, that movie that Catherine, Bigelow won for first female director, Academy Award. But I think the first 20 minutes of the movie gave the very strong impression, again, that torture worked. And that's sort of what led us to bin Laden. Oh, well, then that's okay. But it really, these are these are the questions that don't really sit well with our 24/7 news cycle and little bits. But is that the people, is that who we want to be as a people? Is that, at what point, what is that balance? I don't know. What does that look like? These are really profound questions about who we are and what are we willing to tolerate. And to shift just very briefly to another constant dynamic, constant tension is between security and privacy. And we're still grappling with that for sure. I think 9/11, this again, this one person's opinion, I think we overreacted in such a way that many of the things that we were hoping to prevent have in fact come to pass.
I'm Patrick Gaudreau, I'm from Canada, so many of the details, maybe I follow it from distance, and maybe it's the same for a lot of our colleagues that are international. But I'd like to get your view about how CIA is politics, and the link that you were, or you and your husband were victim of. Is there anything changed in the policy since that happened?
Let me start by saying that and as far as I know, all my former colleagues, we did not serve as Democrats abroad or Republicans abroad. You serve as an American, which is true for the armed forces, true from our diplomatic service. You serve as an American. And honestly, I don't remember, when I first started, I don't remember people, I didn't know what people's political affiliations were. You didn't talk about it because we were professionals. You're doing your job. And I think in the election, I see a turning point is the election in this country of 2000, the highly contested Bush v. Gore, when all of a sudden you began to see this real polarization, compounded by the Supreme Court's decision, of course, to award the presidency to Bush. And that, I think back at the agency, that really was the beginning of people talking in a more political term, even though the vast majority of people that are professionals in the intelligence community, they would rather chew off their right arm than say anything of their analysis or what they were doing in any way was partisan. It should be just the facts, which is why former CIA Director George Tenet famously, when he said famously in the Oval Office about going to war with Iraq, slam dunk. Because he was a very good director in many ways, but in that moment and in that phrase and how it was understood was very much putting his thumb on the scale that should not happen. The CIA is not supposed to be policy prescriptive. And I do know that in the months and years following the Iraq War, their invasion and so forth, I do know that hundreds of years of operational experience walked out the door because they felt it had, well, there are many reasons, we could have a whole other conversation on contractors, but there was also the sense of there is a creeping politicization of our intelligence. And we have to be ever vigilant against that. Every new president comes in, and when he first figures out, apparently President Trump has just figured out that one red button is to order a Coke. But they also figure out, oh my gosh, I have the CIA at my disposal. What can I do? And there's definitely a learning curve, and how you have to be extremely cautious with that. There was a lot of talk a few weeks ago, it seems to have dissipated a bit, about the so-called deep state, meaning those embedded bureaucrats throughout the government and in the intelligence community that, they're going to burrow in and provide some resistance or not, or whatever. You have to be ever vigilant, because otherwise you're a banana republic. You become a banana republic if you allow momentary partisan politics to hold sway over what is the best from a national security viewpoint. And I'll leave on one last point, which is I could make a whole argument about the Iraq War invasion. It was an ideological trial. Hey, we want to do this, and this is why we have, there is a whole stream of thought boosted by so-called intellectuals who said we need to do this for our safety and for Israel's safety. And that is really unfortunate because it didn't actually address our own national security needs. So we are in a time period now where clearly it's unprecedented, which I don't think is partisan to say. It is an unprecedented period of time, and we as citizens need to be really vigilant that, that those in power really keep our national interests at the forefront. One more, Jonathan says.
Hi.
I know you want to have dinner.
So I agree. I wanted to point to jump on something you said towards the end of one of the questions, that the North Korean regime is a cult masquerading as a government. I think everybody here agrees that, the regime should not function, that the people deserve something better. And there are plenty of regimes like that. And at the same time, we have a goal of nonproliferation. And I wonder whether it's a coincidence that many of the states that seek to get weapons of mass destruction are ones that know that we want them gone. I wonder whether there's a legitimate fear on the part of leaders like Kim Jong-un who see what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, and for the sake of not being too graphic, who met a very gruesome end. And I'm wondering, is there a way to harmonize the two, wanting to advocate for regime change and nonproliferation, or whether we have to give one of those up?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in fact, when I was speaking about A.Q. Khan, he's like, hey, I want Pakistan to be at the big boys table, and one way to do that is have a nuclear capability, without question. What Jonathan works on, with the different things that I work on in various fora, is how do you get across the very true message that nuclear weapons do not make us safer, that they really belong in the dustbin of history. They worked for a time under the mutually assured destruction dogma of the Cold War, but now they really are, because of terrorists trying to get a hold of them and others, that they are not going to make you safer. The good news is there have been countries, there have been historical instances, South Africa is one, who all but had it and turned away from it. So I love it when you use quotes from Ronald Reagan, Saint Ronald Reagan, who says, nuclear weapons should be abolished. President Obama, in his first foreign policy speech in Prague in April 2009, said nuclear weapons must be abolished. Well, you have to have more than those at the very top who have this, blue sky dream. It has to come from us. And so I want to leave you with this, where you go back to wherever you're practicing law and whatever your engagement is in your community and so forth. As I think many of us are trying to figure out how do we get re-engaged, or how do I engage in a meaningful way in what is a not normal period. Do ask your elected representatives, what's your position on nuclear weapons? What do you think about that? And so it can be done. I do believe that there is a little window of opportunity here. I know you all need a drink after thinking about nuclear weapons, but there is hope, but it comes from you as the citizens of this country. Hold our government to account for their words and deeds. So I'll leave it at that.
We are, well, we're going to give her a shout out at the end, but we are not just citizens. We are professional advocates, and we are professional analysts of being able to tell the difference between chocolate and shit. Or we're not lawyers. And I mean, earlier today, Jonathan Meyer and the Committee on National Security did a session on cybersecurity. So, and you just think of the combination of how much our security system with nukes relies on computers and how vulnerable it is. I mean, you know, when you start putting it together, I want to give you one quote that my friend William Colby said, and we were in a discussion about it, and he said, my concern is that we're a bunch of experts, we're like ants on a log talking to each other, but some of us see the waterfall. And we don't want to be that way, because we still have, as Jonathan Schell said, the gift of time. So Valerie could do other things. Hopefully she will run for office. That's what I'm going to push her to do. Yeah. And I hope some of us will support her in this. She's also on the board of a wonderful foundation called the Plowshares Foundation, which was founded by a great woman leader, Sally Lilienthal. And the Plowshares Foundation does a lot of good work in this field. I urge you to take a look at it and support it and other similar organizations. But I want to end with this challenge to us, which is we're not winning on this issue, and we're not winning. We're not winning. To get the START treaty out of committee, President Obama pledged $1 trillion. $1 trillion to modernize the arsenal. Now that doesn't tell the rest of the world that we're living up to our nuclear disarmament legal duties under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there's over 130 countries will meet again in June, and there will be a treaty created to prohibit nuclear weapons. But our country is not even participating in the negotiations. And that is scandalous. That it's not in the media, and we're not putting pressure on them as professional advocates. Just going to end it and say, this has to change. It's our responsibility to make it change. We've just heard, the last one we had from our best Secretary of Defense that we've ever had. And we've had in these series, we had Ted Sorensen and Bob McNamara talk about how darn close we actually came on their watch. And we've now just heard from an expert that shows us the kind of character of people who are working to get rid of them. Let's help people like Valerie Plame succeed.
May I just add a few recommendations, since he, did a shout out. So there's Plowshares Fund, Global Zero, but here's a book you want to read next time you're flying back. And well, of course, that's a given. That's a given. But please read Command and Control by Eric Schlosser. It is narrative nonfiction. It reads like a thriller, scare the heck out of you.
And fair game.
Yeah, that's it. And I would also, if on your Netflix, put on your lineup Countdown to Zero, which is a documentary that came out about the threat of nuclear weapons, and it has Gorbachev and Tony Blair and Musharraf and Baker all talking. These are men with literally they had their finger on the button and talking about it. It's extremely well done. So those are a couple recommendations for you. I thank you for your time and your questions.
Thank you.